Enjoying the $5,000 a month, Mom? My son Ethan asked with a warm smile as he wrapped his arms around me beside the towering Christmas tree. The room seemed to freeze around me. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. Christmas music drifted softly through the house. Children laughed near the fireplace, and guests carried plates filled with holiday desserts. But all I could hear were those 7 words. I pulled back slightly and looked at him. "What $5,000? I asked. Ethan laughed at first, the kind of laugh people make when they think someone is joking. "The money I've been sending you every month," he said. "For the last 2 years. The smile slowly disappeared from my face. Around us, the lights on the tree reflected off dozens of glass ornaments. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. It should have been a perfect evening. Instead, I felt a strange chill move through me. "Ethan," I said carefully, "I've never received $5,000 a month." His expression changed immediately. Confusion replaced confidence. "What do you mean?" he asked. Before I could answer, I noticed Vanessa standing several feet away near the dining room entrance. My daughter-in-law had been holding a glass of sparkling cider. Now her fingers tightened around it. For just a second, our eyes met. Something flashed across her face. Not surprise, not confusion, fear. The moment vanished almost instantly, replaced by her usual polished smile. "Is everything okay over here?" she asked as she approached. Ethan looked at her. "Mom says she never got the monthly transfers." Vanessa blinked. "What transfers?" she asked. Her voice sounded smooth, almost rehearsed. Ethan frowned. "The money I've been sending her. Every month. Since Dad passed away." My stomach tightened. My husband had been gone for nearly 3 years. Since then, I had stretched every dollar. I had delayed replacing my aging furnace. I had worn the same winter coat for 4 seasons. Some months, I stood in grocery aisles calculating whether I could afford fresh fruit along with my medication. Never once had I imagined my son believed he was helping me. Vanessa let out a small laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. "Maybe the bank had an issue." Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at me now. Really staring. As if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was the worn cuffs of my sweater. Maybe it was the fact that my shoes had been resoled twice. Maybe it was the simple truth written across my face. "Mom," he said quietly, "you're telling me you never received any of it?" I shook my head. The noise of the Christmas party seemed distant now. Conversations blurred into a dull hum. Across the room, grandchildren opened early gifts while relatives gathered around trays of cookies. Life continued as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something important. Because in that moment, standing beneath the glow of Christmas lights, I realized one of 2 things had to be true. Either my son had never sent the money he claimed to send, or someone had made sure it never reached me. And judging by the look that briefly crossed Vanessa's face, I suddenly knew exactly where I needed to start looking. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of Christmas lights and forced smiles. I remained at the party for another hour, mostly because leaving immediately would have raised even more questions. Ethan tried to continue greeting guests, but I noticed his attention drifting back toward me again and again. Vanessa stayed busy in a way that felt unnatural. She refreshed trays that did not need refreshing. She rearranged decorations that were already perfectly placed. She laughed a little too loudly at conversations that were not particularly funny. Every movement seemed carefully designed to avoid standing still long enough for anyone to study her face. When I finally put on my coat and prepared to leave, Ethan walked me to the front door. Snow had begun to fall outside, covering the driveway in a thin white blanket. "Mom," he said quietly, "we need to talk about this." I looked at him. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be. The little boy who once ran into my kitchen after school carrying a spelling test, desperate to show me the gold star his teacher had drawn at the top. "Not tonight," I said gently. "Tonight is Christmas." He nodded, though I could tell his mind was already working through possibilities. On the drive home, I kept replaying the conversation. $5,000 every month. 24 months. The numbers refused to leave my head. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had done the math at least 10 times. $120,000. The figure felt unreal. My small house sat quietly beneath the falling snow. The porch light cast a warm glow over the front steps. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar silence greeted me. I hung up my coat and stood in the living room for several seconds. Nothing in that room suggested a woman who had received $120,000 over the past 2 years. The carpet was worn near the sofa. The lamp beside my reading chair flickered occasionally because I had postponed replacing it. A blanket I had repaired twice rested neatly across the armrest. I walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Leftovers from earlier in the week occupied most of the shelves. I had become careful with groceries after Harold passed away. Careful with everything, really. I remembered the month my furnace needed repairs. I remembered delaying a dental procedure because the estimate seemed too high. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with a calculator, deciding which expenses could wait another 30 days. Through all of it, I never once blamed Ethan. He had built a successful life. I was proud of him. I assumed he was busy. I assumed distance was simply part of adulthood. But now a new possibility had entered my mind. What if he had not forgotten me at all? What if someone had worked very hard to make sure I believed he had? I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the small stack of mail I had brought inside earlier that day. Most of it was ordinary. Utility statements, advertisements, a grocery coupon booklet. Then I remembered something strange. About 18 months ago, I had received a letter addressed to me from a financial services company. Before I could open it, Vanessa had called. She sounded unusually concerned. She told me it was probably junk mail connected to one of Ethan's business accounts and offered to handle it for me. At the time, I thought nothing of it. There had been other small moments too. Missing packages, documents that never arrived, occasional comments about banking errors that seemed insignificant on their own. Individually, each memory felt harmless. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. Outside, snow continued falling across the quiet neighborhood. Inside, I sat alone beneath the soft glow of the kitchen light, realizing that the hardest part was not the missing money. It was the possibility that for 2 years, someone had been standing between a mother and her son, carefully rewriting the story each of us believed about the other. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The house was still dark, and the world outside my kitchen window looked soft beneath a fresh layer of snow. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the same table where Harold and I had spent countless mornings discussing everything from grocery lists to retirement dreams. The silence felt different now. Not lonely. Focused. For the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was looking at my life through a new lens. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. Ethan. I stared at his name for a moment before answering. Good morning, Mom. His voice sounded tired. Good morning. There was a pause. I barely slept last night. Neither did I. Another pause followed. I checked my records this morning, he said. The transfers are real. Every single one of them. I closed my eyes briefly. Hearing him say it made everything feel more serious. More permanent. How were they sent? I asked. Direct deposit. Automatic transfer. Same account every month. I traced my finger along the rim of my coffee mug. Then it was never my account. Ethan exhaled slowly. That is what I am starting to think. His voice carried something I had not heard in years. Doubt. Not directed at me. Directed somewhere else. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Have you ever changed banks? No. Have you ever authorized someone else to manage your finances? No. Have you ever received paperwork about a new account? Not that I remember. The line went quiet. I could almost hear him thinking. Finally, he said, something is wrong. I looked out the window at the snow-covered backyard. I know. After we ended the call, I found myself walking through the house searching for old documents. I opened filing cabinets and storage boxes. Most contained ordinary records collected over decades. Tax returns, insurance papers, utility statements. Then I found a small folder near the back of a drawer. Inside were several envelopes I had saved simply because something about them had felt unusual at the time. One envelope came from a financial institution I did not recognize. Another contained a notice about an account verification process. I remembered calling Vanessa about it because she had always insisted she was better with financial paperwork than I was. Her response had come quickly. She told me not to worry. She said Ethan's business generated complicated financial correspondence all the time. Looking at the envelopes now, I realized something unsettling. None of them had ever been opened. A few hours later, my phone rang again. This time it was Vanessa. I almost did not answer. Margaret, she said brightly. I just wanted to check on you. How are you feeling after yesterday? Her voice sounded warm, but there was tension beneath it. The kind of tension people carry when they are testing uncertain ground. I am doing fine. I replied. Good, good. She laughed softly. I am sure all of this is just a misunderstanding. There it was again. The same phrase she had used at the party. Misunderstanding. Not mistake. Not error. Misunderstanding. As if the truth were something flexible. Maybe, I said calmly. Ethan seems concerned. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt longer. Well, Ethan can be impulsive sometimes, she said. Once he gets all the information, I am sure everything will make sense. I thanked her for calling and ended the conversation. Then I sat quietly for several minutes. Vanessa had always been composed, always polished, always prepared. Yet for the first time since joining our family, she seemed nervous. Not angry, not defensive, nervous. Later that afternoon, Ethan sent me copies of several transaction records. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Month after month, transfer after transfer. $5,000, $5,000, $5,000. 24 entries in total. Each one completed successfully. Each one supposedly sent for my benefit. At the bottom of the final page was a bank account number. I did not recognize it. But what caught my attention was something else entirely. The mailing address attached to the account was not mine either. My pulse quickened slightly as I read it again. The street name seemed familiar. Very familiar. Then I remembered why. It was the same street where Ethan and Vanessa lived. For several minutes, I simply stared at the address on the document. I knew that street well. I had driven there countless times for birthdays, cookouts, and holiday gatherings. There was no mistake. The account receiving the money was connected to the same neighborhood where Ethan and Vanessa lived. I picked up my phone and called Ethan immediately. He answered before the second ring. Mom, he said, I found something. I could hear movement in the background, followed by the sound of a door closing. What is it? I read the address aloud. Silence followed. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of someone realizing a puzzle piece had just fallen into place. That cannot be right, he finally said. That is our neighborhood. I know. Another pause. Send me the document. Within minutes, I forwarded the file. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. This time, Ethan sounded different. Colder. More focused. I checked property records and account registration data through my attorney, he said. The address belongs to a private mailbox service 2 blocks from our house. I sat down slowly. A mailbox? Yes. His voice tightened. And Mom, there is something else. I waited. The account was opened 25 months ago. My grip tightened around the phone. 25 months. 1 month before the transfers began. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question neither of us wanted to ask. Who opened it? Ethan exhaled heavily. I do not know yet. But something in his voice told me he was beginning to suspect the answer. Over the next few days, strange memories kept surfacing. Small moments I had dismissed at the time. Vanessa insisting that electronic banking was safer than paper statements. Vanessa offering to help update family contact information. Vanessa volunteering to organize records after Harold passed away because she claimed grief made paperwork overwhelming. At the time, her help had seemed thoughtful, generous even. Now those memories felt different. Like footprints appearing in fresh snow once you finally know where to look. 3 days after Christmas, Ethan arrived at my house unexpectedly. He looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes, and the confident ease that usually surrounded him seemed gone. He placed a folder on my kitchen table. Neither of us touched it immediately. Instead, we sat quietly for a moment. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily above us. Finally, Ethan opened the folder. Inside were account summaries, transfer confirmations, registration documents, and legal correspondence. My attorney helped me trace everything, he said quietly. I looked down at the papers. What did you find? Ethan rubbed his forehead. The account was not opened in your name. I felt my stomach sink. Whose name? He looked directly at me. A limited liability company. I frowned. What company? Ethan slid one document toward me. The company name meant nothing to me. But underneath it was another line. A registered contact email. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Then I stopped breathing for a second. Because I recognized the email address instantly. It belonged to Vanessa. The room became very quiet. Outside, a snowplow passed slowly down the street. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Ethan stared at the document as though he wished it would transform into something else. I have checked it 3 times, he said softly. I wanted to be wrong. I looked at my son. The little boy who once believed every problem had a simple explanation. The successful businessman who trusted the people closest to him. The husband who had spent years believing his wife was helping his family. What happens now? I asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. Snowflakes drifted quietly past the glass. Now, he said, his voice steadier than before, I find out how much she has been hiding from both of us. Over the next week, Ethan threw himself into the investigation with the same determination that had helped him build his company from the ground up. He did not tell Vanessa what he had discovered, at least not yet. Instead, he watched. He listened. And little by little, more pieces began falling into place. I only learned the details because he called me almost every evening. Those conversations became a strange comfort. For years, our phone calls had been brief. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Now we talked for an hour at a time. Not because of the money, but because for the first time in a long while, we were both searching for the same truth. One evening Ethan called sounding particularly troubled. Mom, he said, I found something else. I set down my cup of tea. What is it? Do you remember telling me years ago that you never received the anniversary flowers I sent after Dad passed away? I frowned. Yes. I assumed the florist made a mistake. They did not. My stomach tightened. Ethan continued. I found the receipt. The flowers were delivered successfully. I looked out the window as his words settled over me. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Then another. A birthday gift that never arrived. A care package Ethan supposedly sent during a difficult winter. A handwritten letter he once claimed he had mailed after missing Thanksgiving. None of those things had ever reached me. At the time I had assumed life simply got in the way. Now I was no longer sure. There is more, Ethan said quietly. The delivery address on several of those orders was changed after I submitted them. I closed my eyes. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. What had started as missing money was growing into something much larger. It was not only about finances. It was about communication. About access. About connection. Someone had been quietly standing between us for years. 2 days later, Ethan met with his attorney again. By then, the financial trail had expanded considerably. The limited liability company linked to Vanessa had received the monthly transfers. But according to the records, some of the money had later been moved into personal accounts. Other portions had been used for luxury purchases, travel expenses, designer goods, private memberships. None of it had been illegal on the surface because Ethan had voluntarily authorized the original transfers. The problem was that the transfers had been made under false pretenses. The intended recipient had never received them. When Ethan shared this information with me, I felt surprisingly calm. Angry was not the right word. Heartbroken was closer. Not because of the dollar amount. $120,000 was certainly life-changing money. But what hurt more was realizing how many assumptions had been built around those missing payments. Ethan had assumed I was comfortable. I had assumed he rarely thought about me. For 2 years, we had both been living inside a story that was not true. The following Friday afternoon, Ethan called again. This time his voice carried a certainty I had not heard before. I finally know why she was so nervous at Christmas. Why? I asked. There was a brief silence. Because she knew the question would expose everything. I leaned back in my chair. You think she understood the risk? I know she did. He paused. Mom, I found emails. My heart skipped slightly. Emails. Messages between Vanessa and the financial service provider. She specifically requested that account notifications be routed through her. She specifically asked that mailing addresses be updated. I stared at the kitchen wall for several seconds. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was no longer a collection of suspicious coincidences. It was becoming something far more difficult to explain away. Ethan exhaled slowly. I have enough information now to confront her. Outside, the winter sun was beginning to set. Long shadows stretched across the snow-covered yard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind for days. When? Ethan's answer came immediately. At the family New Year's gathering. Everyone will be there. And this time, nobody is leaving without hearing the truth. The days leading up to New Year's Eve moved slowly. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Family group messages continued. Holiday photos were shared. Vanessa posted cheerful pictures online showing perfectly arranged dinners, sparkling decorations, and smiling faces. Anyone looking from the outside would have assumed our family was enjoying a peaceful holiday season. Only a handful of us knew that beneath those polished images, everything was beginning to crack. Ethan became unusually quiet during our phone calls. He was not angry in the way people often imagine anger. He was disappointed, deeply disappointed. More than once he told me, he kept replaying the last 2 years in his mind. Every conversation, every decision, every moment when Vanessa had offered to help with family matters. The more he looked back, the more he found details that no longer made sense. 3 days before New Year's Eve, he called me from his office. "Mom, I found another account." I set aside the book I had been reading. Another account. Yes, smaller transfers. Not as much money, but they were connected to the same company. I listened carefully as he explained. The company tied to the original account had been used repeatedly, not just for the monthly transfers. Several gifts, reimbursements, and family-related expenses had also passed through it. The pattern stretched further back than either of us expected. "How long?" I asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. "Almost 4 years. For years." The numbers settled heavily between us. For years of altered records. For years of redirected communication. For years of assumptions carefully built on information that was never entirely true. That evening I sat alone in my living room thinking about the first time I met Vanessa. She had been charming, intelligent, organized. She remembered birthdays, sent thank you cards, brought desserts to family dinners. I realized that the hardest betrayals are rarely committed by obvious villains. They are committed by people who learn how to earn trust first. On the morning of December 31st, Ethan called one final time before the family gathering. "Everything is ready," he said. "My attorney prepared a complete report." I closed my eyes briefly. "Are you certain you want to do this tonight?" "I am not doing this because of the money anymore." His voice remained calm. "I am doing it because I need the truth." Later that afternoon, I drove to his house. Snow still covered much of the neighborhood, though the roads had been cleared. The sky hung gray overhead, and the cold air carried that particular stillness that often arrives before a new year begins. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several family vehicles already parked outside. My sister-in-law was there. 2 cousins, Ethan's business partner and his wife. The gathering was larger than usual. Everyone seemed excited for the evening ahead. Inside, the house glowed with warm light. Music played softly in the background. The scent of roasted vegetables and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen. Vanessa greeted guests with her usual confidence. If she felt nervous, she hid it well. When she saw me enter, her smile froze for only a fraction of a second before returning. "Margaret," she said warmly, "I am so glad you could make it." "Thank you," I replied. Her eyes searched my face as though trying to determine whether I knew something she did not. I simply smiled. For the next 2 hours, everyone mingled normally. Conversations flowed. Children played board games. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed through the house. Yet beneath it all, I sensed a quiet tension building. Ethan remained composed throughout the evening. He spoke with relatives, helped serve dinner, refilled drinks. But every so often I noticed him glance toward a leather folder resting on a table near his office door. Shortly before midnight, as guests began gathering near the living room television to watch the countdown coverage from New York City, Ethan stood up and cleared his throat. The room gradually fell silent. Vanessa looked up from across the room. For the first time all evening, genuine uncertainty appeared on her face. Ethan picked up the leather folder and held it in both hands. Then he looked directly at his wife and said, "Before we welcome the new year, there is something everyone deserves to hear." The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward Ethan. The television continued playing silently in the background as images of New Year's celebrations flashed across the screen, but nobody was watching anymore. Ethan stood calmly in the center of the room, holding the leather folder. Vanessa remained seated on the sofa. At first, she looked confused, then cautious, then concerned. "I have spent the last week reviewing financial records," Ethan began. His voice was steady, professional, the same voice he used when presenting important information to investors and business partners. "What I found has changed my understanding of several things." Nobody interrupted. My sister-in-law exchanged a glance with one of the cousins. Vanessa forced a small smile. "Ethan, maybe this is not the time," she said lightly. He looked at her. Actually, this is exactly the time. The smile disappeared. Ethan opened the folder and removed several documents. 2 years ago, I began sending my mother $5,000 every month. A murmur moved through the room. Several relatives looked toward me in surprise. Ethan continued. I believe those funds were helping her live comfortably after Dad passed away. Last week, I learned she never received any of them. The room fell silent again. Vanessa shifted slightly in her seat. There must still be some misunderstanding, she said. Her voice sounded strained now. Ethan nodded slowly. That is what I thought too. He lifted one document. So I investigated. He began laying papers across the coffee table. Bank records, account summaries, registration documents, each page placed carefully beside the next. Nobody spoke. Vanessa stared at the documents without touching them. The money was deposited into an account connected to a company created 25 months ago, Ethan said. That company was linked to an email address. He paused, then looked directly at Vanessa. Your email address. A sharp breath escaped from someone near the fireplace. Vanessa immediately shook her head. That does not prove anything. No, Ethan agreed calmly. Which is why I kept looking. He removed another document from the folder. The account notifications were redirected through requests submitted under your credentials. The mailing address was changed. The account management permissions were modified. Every change traces back to you. Vanessa's face had grown pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed completely unprepared. Ethan continued speaking. Not angrily, not dramatically, just fact after fact, one by one, the way truth often arrives when nobody interrupts it. Then came the part that affected me most. Ethan picked up a separate stack of papers. This was never only about the money. He described the redirected flower deliveries, the missing gifts, the altered addresses, the correspondence that never reached me. As he spoke, memories surfaced in my mind. Holidays that felt strangely distant. Birthdays that seemed forgotten. Years of believing my son had slowly drifted away. Across the room, several relatives were staring at Vanessa with expressions of disbelief. Finally, she stood up. I was trying to help, she said. You do not understand the pressure I was under. Ethan remained calm. Help whom? She looked around the room. All of us. The finances. The family. Everything. Her explanation sounded weaker with every sentence. Because the documents sitting on the table told a different story. One built from dates, signatures, transfers, and records. Facts are difficult to argue with when they are arranged in order. Vanessa's eyes moved around the room, searching for support. She found none. Then she looked at me. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. I realized something then. For years I had wondered why my relationship with Ethan felt different. Why conversations seemed shorter. Why distance had grown between us despite my efforts. Sitting there surrounded by evidence, I finally understood. The distance had not appeared naturally. It had been carefully built. And now, piece by piece, it was collapsing in front of everyone. For several seconds after Ethan finished speaking, nobody moved. The only sound came from the television in the corner, counting down the final minutes of the year. Vanessa remained standing beside the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The confidence she usually carried so effortlessly seemed to have vanished. Ethan did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her with anger. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. The evidence was already on the table. There was nothing left to dramatize. Vanessa, he said quietly, if there is something I do not know, now is the time to tell me. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked around the room. Every face reflected the same question. Why? Finally, she sat down slowly. Her shoulders seemed smaller than before. It was never supposed to become this big, she said. Nobody interrupted. At first, I thought I was protecting our future. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. By taking money intended for my mother? Vanessa lowered her eyes. I told myself it was temporary. I thought I would put it back eventually. The explanation hung awkwardly in the room. Even she seemed to hear how weak it sounded. Because temporary decisions do not continue for years. Temporary decisions do not require changed addresses, redirected accounts, and hidden records. My sister-in-law shook her head quietly. One of the cousins looked away in disappointment. Ethan remained calm. And the letters? He asked. The gifts? Vanessa did not answer immediately. Tears gathered in her eyes. I was afraid, she finally whispered. Afraid of what? Ethan asked, afraid that you would always choose her over me. The room fell silent again. I felt no satisfaction hearing those words, only sadness, because beneath all the paperwork and deception, I could finally see the insecurity that had driven so many terrible decisions. Vanessa continued speaking, her voice trembling slightly. She described feeling threatened by the bond Ethan and I shared after Harold passed away. She admitted that small decisions became larger ones. One altered. A dress led to another. One hidden transfer led to another. Each choice became easier after the previous one. Nobody defended her actions. But for the first time, everyone understood how they had happened. Ethan listened without interruption. When she finished, he opened the folder one last time and removed a final document. I met with my attorney this morning, he said. The funds can be traced. The records are complete. Vanessa closed her eyes briefly. She already knew what that meant. I am not interested in revenge, Ethan continued. I am interested in honesty. His words seemed to surprise everyone, including Vanessa. The money will be returned through a structured agreement. Every account connected to this situation will be disclosed. No more secrets. Vanessa nodded slowly. There was no argument left to make. The truth had already won. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan turned toward me. For a moment, his voice caught slightly. Mom, there is something I need to say. Every person in the room looked at him. For 2 years, I believed you were comfortable. I believed you were doing well because I thought I was helping. I never stopped to ask enough questions. I should have. I felt tears gathering in my own eyes. Not because of the money, because of the regret in his voice. You trusted someone you loved? I said softly. That is not a crime. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. Maybe not, but I should have paid closer attention. The television began the final 60-second countdown to midnight. Around us, relatives stood quietly. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated yet. We were all watching something far more important than a new calendar year. We were watching a family finally stop pretending. And for the first time in a very long time, the truth was sitting openly in the middle of the room. When midnight finally arrived, nobody rushed to celebrate. The countdown ended. Fireworks flashed across the television screen. Somewhere outside, distant cheers echoed through the neighborhood. Yet inside the house, a different kind of new year had already begun. One built on honesty instead of assumptions. Slowly, relatives began speaking again. Quiet conversations replaced the heavy silence. Some people stepped outside for fresh air. Others gathered in small groups around the kitchen. The tension that had filled the room for the past hour gradually eased. Not because everything had been solved, but because the truth was no longer hidden. A few days later, life began moving forward. The financial recovery process started exactly as Ethan had promised. Attorneys handled paperwork. Accounts were reviewed. Records were corrected. The missing funds would eventually be returned through formal agreements. But strangely, those details mattered less and less to me as time passed. One cold January morning, Ethan arrived at my house carrying 2 cups of coffee. He knocked once and let himself in, just as he used to years ago. We sat together at the kitchen table while snow drifted quietly outside. For a while, neither of us talked about bank accounts or legal documents. Instead, we talked about ordinary things. A movie he had recently watched. A recipe he remembered from childhood. A fishing trip he and Harold had taken when he was 12 years old. Somewhere during that conversation, I realized what I had missed most was not financial security. It was this: time, connection, presence. Before leaving, Ethan handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed the 3 of us standing together years earlier at a county fair. Harold stood between us with one arm around my shoulder and the other around Ethan. We were all laughing at something outside the frame. I found it while going through old boxes, Ethan said. I stared at the photograph for several seconds. Your father loved that day. Ethan smiled softly. I know. He hesitated before speaking again. Mom, I cannot change the last 2 years. No, I agreed gently. None of us can. But I can do better going forward. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. That is all anyone can do. After he left, I placed the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. Over the following months, our relationship continued to heal. We spoke regularly. We visited more often. The distance that had once felt permanent slowly disappeared. As for Vanessa, she faced the consequences of her choices. Not dramatic consequences, Not public humiliation. Something more difficult. Accountability. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Whether she would succeed was a question only time could answer. One afternoon in early spring, I sat on my porch watching sunlight warm the neighborhood after a long winter. Birds moved through the trees. Children rode bicycles down the street. The world felt peaceful. I thought back to that holiday gathering when a simple question changed everything. At the time, I believed the story was about missing money. I was wrong. The money had only revealed a deeper loss. For years, I believed my son had slowly stopped caring. Ethan believed I was living comfortably without needing his help. Both of us had been carrying pain built on a lie neither of us created. The real victory was never recovering $120,000. The real victory was recovering the truth, recovering trust, recovering family. As I looked at the photograph above my fireplace later that evening, I found myself smiling. Harold used to say that truth has a way of arriving eventually, even when it takes the long road. Standing there in the quiet warmth of my home, I finally understood what he meant. The money was returned. The records were corrected. But the greatest gift of all was something that never appeared on a bank statement. I got my son back.